Salt is one of the cheapest, most commonplace items. It sells for less than a loaf of bread, and during winter, we scatter it liberally on roads and sidewalks. However, there was once a time when salt was considered rare and valuable. In Salt, Mark Kurlansky argues that throughout much of human history, salt was a precious commodity, one that significantly shaped civilizations. He traces the history of salt, describing the role it played in nourishing our ancestors, driving innovation, building empires, and even provoking rebellions. Kurlansky, an American journalist, has published over 30 books on topics ranging from the history of cod to the history of nonviolent activism. While Salt is also a history book, it isn't just for history buffs. It spans a variety of topics ranging from cooking to engineering, making it relevant to anyone seeking to better understand why the world looks how it does today. We'll begin this guide with some background information on salt, such as its chemistry and its many varieties. Next, we'll explore salt's impact throughout history. We've organized this history into 5 themes. We'll begin with salt's biological significance, its role in shaping cuisines, and technological innovations related to salt. Then, we'll describe salt's impact on the environment as well as its economic and political significance. Within each theme, we'll cite examples from 4 historical periods: ancient history, prior to 500 CE, the Middle Ages or medieval history, 500 to 1500, early modern history, 1500 to 1800, and modern history, 1800 onwards. Throughout this guide, we'll supplement Kurlansky's history of salt with relevant concepts in chemistry, food science, and geology. We'll also update the book's ideas with recent research on how we harvest and use salt today. What is salt? When most people think of salt, they likely picture a sprinkling of white crystals and imagine a salty taste. However, according to Kurlansky, salt is more than this. He explains that salt is a term chemists use to describe a compound that's produced when an acid reacts with a base. Kurlansky elaborates on the diversity of salts with the following facts. Fact 1. Only some salt is edible. Some of the most common edible salts include table salt, sodium chloride, and baking soda, sodium bicarbonate. Inedible ones include barium chloride, a highly toxic salt used to make red pigments. Short-form note: some edible salts, such as table salt, are toxic if you eat them in extremely large quantities. Fact 2. Salt can taste salty, sour, or bitter. For instance, magnesium chloride is a bitter salt that's often found in baby formula. Short-form note: magnesium chloride is included in baby formula because it helps develop babies' muscles. Fact 3. Not all salt is white. It can also be pink, red, gray, or other colors depending on how and where it's harvested. For instance, some salt is pink because it contains traces of several minerals. Short-form note: lamps made from Himalayan pink salt have become popular in recent years due to claims that they purify the air and release negative ions that boost your mood and promote healthy sleep. Current scientific research doesn't support these claims. Additional properties of salts. When describing salt's various properties, Kurlansky focuses on their edibility, taste, and color. However, scientists and manufacturers who work with salts also consider salt's other properties, such as melting point and odor. Melting point. Engineers pay attention to salt's melting points because they can use molten salts for a variety of technologies. For instance, molten salt is used on solar power towers because it absorbs the sun's heat, producing electricity. Odor. Some salts produce an unpleasant odor when they encounter moisture. For instance, throughout history, people have used the salt ammonium carbonate as the active ingredient in smelling salt, something pungent that you sniff to make you alert when you're feeling faint. Salt's biological significance. According to Kurlansky, salt has played an important role throughout history because it's necessary for humans and animals' survival. Salt is crucial to cell function, brain and nervous system function, and digestion. Each of these bodily processes uses up salt, so we need to consume it to replenish our salt levels. Short-form note: why is salt necessary for these bodily processes? When you eat salt, it separates into its 2 component ions, chloride and sodium. These ions dissolve in the fluid surrounding your cells and help conduct electricity that powers your cells. This electricity allows you to contract your muscles and transmit nerve impulses. Additionally, both of these ions play a crucial role in digestion. Chloride is one of the ingredients in stomach acid, and sodium helps you absorb food's nutrients. Kurlansky adds that to stay healthy, we and animals have to consume the right amount of salt. When you don't consume enough salt, you become nauseated and weak. If you're deprived of salt for too long, you die. On the other hand, eating too much salt may also harm you. For instance, some experts claim that excessive salt consumption raises your blood pressure. How much salt should you consume? Research supports Kurlansky's claim that eating too little salt can harm your health and even lead to death. Specifically, a diet too low in sodium can increase your risk of type 2 diabetes, heart disease, heart failure, and other issues. To ensure you eat enough salt, experts recommend adults consume no less than a quarter teaspoon of salt, around 500 milligrams, per day. Research also supports Kurlansky's notion that consuming too much salt is unhealthy. Experts offer different recommendations for different groups. Most adults should eat less than 1 teaspoon, around 2,300 milligrams, of salt per day. Salt-sensitive groups, older adults, African Americans, people with high blood pressure, and people with diabetes, should consume closer to 3/4 of a teaspoon, around 1,500 milligrams, daily. Salt's culinary significance. In addition to enabling our survival, salt has culinary significance. Kurlansky argues that salt has played an important role in shaping cuisines around the world. First, salt preserves food, making it possible to eat when food production is low, such as during droughts. Second, salt is a seasoning that makes food more flavorful and palatable. In this section, we'll further explore these two uses of salt. Use 1. Preserving food. According to Kurlansky, for most of history, salting was the primary method of preserving food. Only recently in modern history have we reduced our dependency on salt preservation, due to innovations such as refrigeration, freezing, and canning. Short-form note: while salt is no longer the primary way of preserving food, it's still used as one of several preservatives in many shelf-stable foods. Studies reveal that when food manufacturers reduce the salt content of processed meat and cheese, it's more likely those foods will carry bacteria responsible for botulism, a life-threatening illness that attacks your nervous system. Here, we'll explore two main methods of preserving food with salt prior to these innovations: curing and pickling. Preservation Method 1. Salt curing. First, Kurlansky explains that when you salt cure food, you surround it with salt and give the salt time to penetrate the food. Salt prevents food from spoiling in two ways. 1. It kills bacteria, and 2. It dehydrates the food, preventing more bacteria from growing. Bacteria thrive in moist environments, such as the flesh of animals and fish. The science of salt curing and sugar curing. The ability to dehydrate food and kill its bacteria isn't unique to salt. Sugar also achieves these same results, using the same processes. Both salt and sugar destroy bacteria by interrupting their enzyme activity and unraveling their DNA. Furthermore, salt and sugar both dehydrate food through the same two processes: osmosis and diffusion. In Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat, Samin Nosrat explains that these processes reflect chemicals' natural tendency to achieve equilibrium, an equal concentration of water and solutes, sugar, salt, or another compound, on either side of a food cell walls. Let's break down how each process works. In osmosis, water moves from an area of low solute concentration within the food cell walls to an area of high solute concentration outside the cell walls. This process dehydrates the food and leaves the outer surface of the food damp. In diffusion, a solute, such as salt or sugar, moves from an area of high solute concentration outside the food cell walls to an area of low solute concentration inside the cell walls. This results in an even distribution of salt throughout the food. According to Kurlansky, people throughout history have depended on salt-cured meat and fish. The ancient Egyptians were likely the first to cure fish in salt. This helped them survive when the Nile flooded less than usual and failed to irrigate enough crops. In medieval Europe, salt-cured fish, especially salted cod, prevented famine and sustained armies. More specifically, the Basques, whose medieval empire stretched across modern-day Spain, discovered that cod is ideal for salt curing. It cures rapidly because it's low in fat. Short-form note: these traditions of salt-curing meat continue today. In Egypt, salted fish remains an important menu item when Egyptians celebrate Sham el-Nessim, a national holiday that marks the start of spring. In the Basque region of Spain, salted cod remains popular, but it's typically not eaten in its dried form. Cooks buy it from the market fried and salted, then they soak it for a couple of days to rehydrate it before incorporating it into dishes. Preservation method 2. Pickling. Whereas throughout history, meat, cheese, and fish were mostly salt-cured, vegetables and fruits were mostly pickled. Kurlansky explains that when you pickle food, you allow it to age and ferment in the absence of oxygen, typically in a jar. Fermentation is when the sugars in food break down, producing lactic acid, a natural preservative. Salt plays a crucial role in this process. When you add salt flakes or brine, salty water, to the pickling jar, it prevents yeast from forming. Yeast produces alcohol, not pickled food. Short-form note: while Kurlansky uses the terms fermentation and pickling interchangeably in his book, others insist that these are two different processes. According to one expert, pickling and fermentation both involve salt as a preservation agent, but these two processes produce a sour flavor for different reasons. Pickled foods, such as pickled onions, are sour because they're typically produced by submerging food in an acidic solution made of salt, water, and an acid such as vinegar. By contrast, fermented foods, such as kimchi, are sour because during the fermentation process, lactic acid bacteria that naturally exist in the food produce a sour flavor. According to Kurlansky, throughout history, people have enjoyed and depended on pickled vegetables and fruits. The ancient Chinese were the first to pickle food, specifically soybeans and other vegetables. In ancient Rome, the working class consumed many olives, which are pickled in brine. Throughout medieval Europe, people ate sauerkraut, pickled cabbage. It provided them with nourishment throughout long and harsh winters. It was also a staple on European ships because its high vitamin C content prevents scurvy, a painful disease caused by vitamin C deficiency that involves bleeding gums and fatigue. Pickles around the world. Kurlansky mostly focuses on presenting the history of pickled foods in Asia and Europe. However, this is arguably too limited a geographical focus. In Pickles, a Global History, Jan Davison provides historical examples of pickling traditions in Latin America, the Middle East, and North Africa. Let's look at several examples. For thousands of years, Peruvians have been eating ceviche, a dish that features raw fish and fermented fruit juice. Since the people of Mesopotamia began pickling vegetables in vinegar around 2000 BCE, torture, assorted pickles, have remained popular throughout the Middle East. Pickled lemons have been popular for millennia in North African countries such as Morocco. Use 2. Seasoning food. Next, Kurlansky claims that people throughout history have used salt to season their dishes, especially to balance or highlight other flavors, such as spiciness, bitterness, and sweetness. For instance, since medieval times, Swedes have believed that salt brings out sugar's sweetness. They use both salt and sugar to season foods such as fish and licorice. The chemistry behind salt's relationship to other flavors. Research in food science supports Kurlansky's claim that salt affects how we perceive bitterness and sweetness. Compounds containing sodium, such as salt, reduce the flavor of bitterness. For instance, salt tones down vegetables' naturally bitter vitamins and antioxidants. According to research, salt's ability to suppress bitter flavors in a dish allows you to more easily taste that dish's sweetness. This may be why Swedes use both salt and sugar to season fish, which can be bitter, and licorice, which contains a bitter compound. While salt affects our ability to taste bitterness and sweetness, recent research suggests that spicy flavors enhance a dish's saltiness. If you reduce the amount of salt in a recipe and increase its spiciness, the dish may still taste salty enough for you. Researchers theorize that increasing the spiciness of foods in your diet may reduce your dependence on salt. This could help prevent some of the negative health outcomes associated with a high-salt diet. Let's explore two main ingredients that have been used throughout history to season food: salty sauce and salt crystals. Ingredient 1. Salty sauce. According to Kurlansky, for millennia, people have enhanced dishes using salty sauces. Salt curing and pickling often produced these sauces as a byproduct. For instance, during ancient times, the Romans and the Vietnamese produced salty sauces, garum and nuoc mam, respectively, by straining the liquid left over from pickling fish. Short-form note: given the uncanny similarities between garum and nuoc mam, some wonder if ancient Silk Road traders may have brought garum to Asia, leading to Vietnamese nuoc mam. However, culinary historians claim that there's no evidence of this connection. A more likely theory is that nuoc mam evolved from Chinese soy sauce. Ingredient 2. Salt crystals. Kurlansky claims that in ancient times, people rarely seasoned their food with table salt, the white crystals found in salt shakers. They didn't need to. Salt-preserved food and sauces provided enough saltiness. When modern innovations in food preservation replaced salt-based preservation, more people began seasoning dishes with salt crystals. This eventually led to the popularization of uniform-sized, white salt crystals that people stored in tabletop salt shakers. Short-form note: it's common to see salt shakers on tables in Western countries, but other tabletops around the world tend to feature different condiments, some of which are salty. For instance, chili-based awais paste is a popular condiment in Ethiopia. Salsa is a tabletop staple in Mexico, and bottles or bowls of fish sauce sit on tabletops across Thailand and Laos. Salt's impact on innovation. Because salt is necessary for life and eating, people throughout history have been motivated to develop ways to harvest it. Kurlansky argues that throughout history, salt has driven technological and scientific innovation. We'll begin this section by exploring where salt is found on Earth so that we can better understand salt harvesting innovations. Next, we'll describe two of the main ways salt was harvested throughout history. Finally, we'll examine how salt also played a role in other industries' innovations. Where is salt found? Kurlansky explains that salt is found in water. Salt is found in oceans, springs, and some lakes. Underground salt deposits containing rock salt, salt in hard, mineral form, can span hundreds of miles. Some take the form of salt domes, mounds of salt that form when tectonic activity forces underground deposits upward. Above ground, some mountains also contain large deposits of rock salt. According to Kurlansky, for centuries, scientists have wondered and debated why the Earth is so rich in salt. Today, there's a general consensus that salt deposits on land and underground got their salt from the ocean, but scientists don't agree on why ocean water is salty. The origin of Earth's salty oceans and salt deposits. Since the publishing of Salt in 2002, scientists have converged around a theory that there are two main processes that continually replenish the ocean's salinity, saltiness. Process 1. Hydrothermal vents increase the salinity of ocean water. First, low-salinity ocean water flows into these cracks in the seafloor until it reaches magma below the Earth's crust. Next, this magma heats up the water, causing chemical reactions that form minerals, including salt. Finally, hydrothermal vents and underwater volcanoes return this high-salinity water to the ocean. Process 2. Land runoff flows into the ocean. Rainwater erodes rocks on land, creating a solution of dissolved salts that flows into nearby waterways, such as rivers. Eventually, these waterways flow into the ocean. Geologists also explain how the ocean played a role in creating salt deposits above and below the ground, a topic that Kurlansky doesn't explain in detail. Earlier in Earth's history, shallow seas spanned entire continents. As the Earth cooled and its climate became drier, much of this seawater evaporated, exposing land masses. However, some of this water collected in land basins that were caught in a cycle of evaporating and then receiving an influx of new ocean water. Over time, This cycle left behind salt deposits. Tectonic activity then altered the depth of these deposits. Some were forced deeper underground, and others were pushed upwards, forming salt domes and salt-filled mountains. Innovations in harvesting salt. Method 1. Solar evaporation. According to Kurlansky, the oldest and most common method of harvesting salt is relying on the sun to evaporate water from lakes and the sea. This process leaves behind salt crystals. The ancient Chinese pioneered this method. As early as 6000 BCE, they raked and collected salt crystals that formed on lake beds in the summer. Eventually, they and others around the world started making artificial ponds by collecting seawater and lake water on land. In the Middle Ages, the North African Muslims were likely the first to develop a more advanced, efficient method of solar evaporation. First, they collected seawater in an artificial pond and waited for it to partially evaporate. Next, they used pumps and gates to move this water into another pond, or a series of ponds, where it would evaporate further. Finally, new water was pumped into the first pool to start the evaporation process anew. This process was efficient because it allowed for simultaneous evaporation across multiple ponds. Today, people continue to use various methods of solar evaporation to produce salt. Solar evaporation methods used today. Some small-scale, artisan salt producers continue to use a method of salt raking similar to that used by the ancient Chinese. For instance, salt harvesters in Hawaii use traditional methods to evaporate seawater in shallow, man-made ponds. They rake white salt from the ponds and use it in two ways. They either use the salt to season food, or they mix it with red clay and use it for healing and ritual blessings. Furthermore, both artisan and industrial salt producers continue to use multi-pond solar evaporation methods similar to those likely developed by medieval North African Muslims. Recent research demonstrates that halophilic bacteria, salt-loving bacteria, improve this multi-pond evaporation process. Salt ponds containing halophiles evaporate faster. These bacteria absorb light energy due to their red color, which raises the pond's temperature and hastens evaporation. Furthermore, these bacteria's chemical reactions reduce the number of impurities, such as calcium and magnesium, among the salt crystals. Method 2. Mining. Kurlansky claims that drilling is the main way to harvest underground brine. The Chinese lay claim to the first innovation in salt drilling. Around 250 BCE, they used bamboo tubes to siphon brine out of wells. Around a millennium later, they used percussion drilling to dig deeper. This process involves a seesaw-like lever that pounds a metal rod into the ground. Short-form note: why were the ancient Chinese consistently the first to invent a wide variety of salt harvesting methods? In Guns, Germs, and Steel, Jared Diamond claims that for most of ancient and medieval history, China was much more technologically advanced than other regions around the world. For instance, the Chinese were also the first to invent cast iron, gunpowder, magnetic compasses, and paper. According to Diamond, one likely factor behind China's early inventiveness is that food production began relatively early in Asia due to geographic and environmental factors. This led to population booms, and inventions tend to arise and progress rapidly in areas with higher populations. In the Middle Ages, people developed a more efficient way of mining salt: solution mining. This method involves pumping water into mines, siphoning out brine, and boiling it. According to Kurlansky, modern salt producers today continue to engage in solution mining, and they evaporate the brine using machines called vacuum evaporators. Short-form note: today, some salt producers continue to evaporate brine using vacuum evaporators, but instead of getting the brine from underground deposits like the medieval Austrians, they use brine produced by desalination plants. These plants convert seawater into fresh water for agriculture and drinking, and high-concentration brine is a byproduct of this process. These plants typically release this brine back into the ocean. Some experts argue that using this byproduct for salt production instead has two benefits. First, it speeds up the vacuum evaporation process, since the brine is already concentrated. Second, it's more environmentally friendly than releasing the brine into the ocean, which studies reveal harms marine life. In modern times, salt drilling led to the expansion of new industries, such as the oil industry. In the early 20th century, harvesters drilling into a Texan salt dome unexpectedly hit oil, and soon, the U.S. and other countries began extracting oil by drilling near salt. Short-form note. Kurlansky describes this discovery in Texas as one that transformed the oil industry generally, but this may be an overstatement. This event expanded the oil industry in the U.S. specifically, but prior to this, major overseas oil companies had already expanded to global markets. For instance, by the late 1800s, the Russian oil industry was already exporting oil globally. Oil and natural gas often gather near salt because salt deposits form dense barriers around which organic material accumulates. Over time, this organic matter decomposes, becoming valuable fuel. Short-form note. While many salt domes provide a reliable source of oil, drilling for oil near salt can contaminate the oil with salt. Salt-contaminated oil corrodes metal machines in oil refineries, and it can be costly to repair these machines. Other salt-related innovations. According to Kurlansky, salt has also played a key role in other technological innovations beyond those related to salt harvesting. Here are several examples. In ancient times, Egyptians used salt to preserve bodies for mummification. Short-form note. Today, embalmers continue to include salt in their process, along with other compounds such as formaldehyde. The ancient Chinese used saltpeter, potassium nitrate, to invent gunpowder. Short-form note. Saltpeter is no longer used in gunpowder. However, it's still used in various products such as pesticides, fertilizers, and fireworks. In the Middle Ages, people used salt for various purposes, such as glazing pottery. Short-form note. Industrial pottery production no longer relies on salt glazing, but some potters still use this method. Today, people use salt to de-ice roads because salt lowers water's freezing point. Short-form note. Recently, several cities have instead started de-icing roads with sugar beet juice, which also lowers water's freezing point. Some claim sugar beet juice is a more eco-friendly and cost-effective de-icer compared to salt. Salt industry's impact on the environment. Kurlansky argues that throughout history, salt industries and salt-related innovations have degraded the environment. Environmental damage in the English county of Cheshire, England's leading salt producer for several centuries, exemplifies several of the ways salt industries can degrade the environment. Destruction of forests. Wood fueled Cheshire's brine boiling process of harvesting salt, and by the 17th century, salt harvesters had cleared most of the county's forests. Air pollution. In the late 1800s, coal-burning furnaces fueled brine boiling, and filled Cheshire's skies with black plumes of soot. Sinkholes. Starting in the 18th century, sinkholes began wrecking homes and bridges in Cheshire. When harvesters pumped excessive brine from underground reserves, groundwater filled the gaps and dissolved the salt rock, causing sinkholes. Salt industry's impact on the environment today. Although today's salt harvesters no longer rely on forest wood for fuel, modern industries that produce and rely on salt production continue to contribute to air pollution and the formation of sinkholes. For instance, one of the high-profile environmental disasters, the Bayou Corn sinkhole disaster, was a result of excessive salt drilling. In 2012, a Texas driller that produced brine for the chemical industry created a 37-acre sinkhole that caused small earthquakes, killed trees, and forced many local residents to relocate. Since the 1970s, there's been a growing interest in salt harvesting methods that rely on solar energy due to evidence that this method can prevent environmental degradation. For example, Indian salt harvesters have prevented over 12,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide from entering the atmosphere by pumping brine using solar energy instead of diesel generators. Furthermore, solar saltworks, salty habitats where you can harvest salt, can protect and rehabilitate land that other industries have degraded. For instance, solar saltworks increase biodiversity because they protect salt marshes, where many plants and animals thrive. Salt's economic and political significance. Salt industries throughout history may have damaged the environment, but leaders of salt industries believed this damage was worth it, because salt production was extremely lucrative. Kurlansky argues that for most of human history, salt had both economic and political significance due to the profitability of the salt industry. In this section, we'll explore how salt has shaped economies and politics for millennia. We've organized this section into 3 themes: the role salt played in 1. Trade, 2. Empire building, and 3. Rebellions and wars. Theme 1. The salt trade was widespread. According to Kurlansky, salt was one of the first commodities traded over vast distances. For instance, around 2800 BCE, Egyptians exported salted fish to the Phoenicians, who occupied the North African coast. The Phoenicians then traded Egyptian salted fish and North African salt with the rest of the Mediterranean. Short-form note: other historical records reveal that the ancient Egyptians may have been engaged in long-distance trade of other goods even earlier than this. Artifacts from the 4th millennium BCE reveal that pre-dynastic Egyptians traded with ancient Mesopotamians. Gold may have been one of the commodities they traded. Furthermore, new archaeological evidence suggests that Phoenicians not only traded salt produced by others, such as Egyptians and North Africans, but also eventually formed colonies on the Atlantic coast of the Iberian Peninsula to produce their own products for export, including sea salt. Why was salt such a valuable, widely traded commodity? Kurlansky provides 2 reasons. First, salt was precious because, as we explored earlier, all humans and livestock need it to survive. Short-form note: humans and animals still need salt to survive today, so why is it no longer considered precious? One reason may be that salt is no longer scarce due to technological developments related to locating and harvesting salt. Only 6% of salt produced today is used for human consumption, suggesting that there's ample salt to meet our dietary needs. Second, salt was widely traded and highly valued because not all regions had easy access to this mineral. Salt industries arose where it was easy to harvest salt, such as areas with plenty of coastlines, for sea salt production. These regions traded with areas that had less access to salt and therefore considered salt highly valuable, such as northern countries whose climates were too rainy or dark to efficiently evaporate water from sea salt. How access to salt influences economies today. Although salt is no longer as scarce a resource today as it was throughout ancient and medieval history, some regions around the world continue to have higher access to salt than others. Because of this, salt continues to be a valuable, widely traded commodity. It's not just northern countries that struggle to produce salt. Maps of global salt deposits reveal that some more southern inland areas, such as Central Africa, lack access to both coastal sea salt and underground salt deposits. Regions lacking access to natural salt deposits depend on imports from other countries. Additionally, some areas with access to salt, such as areas with plenty of coastlines, still depend on foreign imports of salt for other reasons. For instance, the Philippines no longer produces much salt and relies on foreign imports for more than 90% of its salt needs. One reason they depend on foreign imports is that salt farms along the Filipino coast have been demolished to make room for commercial ventures, homes, and other industries. Furthermore, climate change is altering salt production and which regions have access to producing salt. In regions that rely on solar evaporation, increased rains are threatening salt production. For instance, heavy rains in Cambodia have led to a steep decline in their salt harvest. As a result, salt prices in Cambodia have surged. On the other hand, climate change is causing drought in other areas. Drought that improves solar evaporation, boosting sea salt production. For example, sea salt production in France nearly doubled due to droughts that are linked to climate change. Theme 2. Control over salt strengthened empires. Kurlansky argues that because salt was so profitable, many empires expanded their territories, grew rich, and increased their power by controlling salt industries. For instance, in ancient China, the Qin dynasty instituted a state-controlled monopoly over salt. Revenue from their salt monopoly funded armies and defensive structures such as the Great Wall of China. Short-form note: China's state-controlled salt monopoly was not only a policy of the ancient past. This monopoly continued until only recently in history. In 2017, the Chinese government started allowing salt producers to determine their own prices and sell directly to the market. Empires also strengthened their economic power by colonizing areas that were rich in salt. For example, in the 17th century, Britain harvested and profited off salt from its Caribbean colonies, such as Bermuda. It traded this salt with North Americans in exchange for salt cod. Enslavers fed this salt cod to enslaved Caribbeans working on sugar plantations. Short-form note. In Guns, Germs, and Steel, Jaron Diamond argues that Europe's advanced technology, including salt harvesting technology, was a factor leading to their conquest of the Americas. According to Diamond, European societies were technologically advanced because they had geographic advantages such as a temperate climate. These advantages led to ample food production, causing population booms, the development of industries, and new inventions. Critics claim that this argument makes it seem inevitable for geographically advantaged regions like Europe to colonize. These critics accuse Diamond of downplaying the role that Europeans' colonial and racist ideas played in their decisions to conquer the Americas. Theme 3. Power struggles over salt-fueled rebellions and wars. Kurlansky makes clear that throughout history, people in colonized regions often resisted empires' control over salt industries. They staged rebellions, which often turned into wars, to demand that empires grant them autonomy over salt production and profits. Let's explore two examples of this: the role conflict over salt played in the American Revolution and the role it played in the Indian independence movement. Example 1. The American Revolution. According to Kurlansky, the American-British conflict over salt was one of the catalysts for the American Revolutionary War. Let's trace the events that led to this war. First, in the late 1600s, the British noticed and grew worried about self-reliance among American colonists. Many of these colonists were producing their own salt, which threatened the British ideal of how a colonial relationship should work, one in which the colonists depended on Britain and sold all their commodities to Britain. To discourage this self-reliance and trade, the British took two actions that increased American dependence on British salt. First, they made British salt cheaper than colony-produced salt so that colonists would buy British salt instead. Second, the British forbade colonists from trading salt with foreigners. Kurlansky argues that Americans' anger over British control of their salt production and trade was one of the factors that contributed to the tension between Britain and the American colonists, tension that eventually boiled over into war. In the mid-1700s, Britain sensed American colonists' desires for independence, so they enacted taxes and tariffs to discourage American trade with foreigners, and they stationed troops in Boston to quell any American resistance. In 1775, enraged and armed American colonists fired on these troops, beginning the American Revolutionary War. Other catalysts for the American Revolutionary War. Kurlansky identifies the conflict over salt as one of the catalysts behind the American Revolutionary War, but he doesn't mention the other catalysts that arguably played a more direct role in initiating the conflict. Historians argue that several British laws that taxed American colonists, as well as limited their trade and self-sufficiency, contributed to Americans' desire for independence. For instance, one of these laws, the American Revenue Act, also known as the Sugar Act, increased taxes on several goods to raise revenue for Britain. The law increased American colonists' resistance to British rule because they believed that it was a violation of their rights to tax them without allowing their representation in Parliament. The Sugar Act was arguably a greater catalyst for the war than the salt taxes because the idea of no taxation without representation was a crucial issue and a rallying call behind American resistance to British rule. Example 2. The Indian Independence Movement. According to Kurlansky, India's independence movement also began as a conflict over salt production. The conflict started brewing in the 18th century when the British worried that the high-quality salt produced in India would threaten the profits of salt produced in England. To prevent this, they established a British monopoly over salt made by Indian saltworks, requiring Indian salt producers to sell all their salt to the British. Indian salt harvesters staged a rebellion against this monopoly in 1817 by attacking British-controlled saltworks in India. Indian resistance to Britain's control of salt production reached new heights in the early 1900s when Indians grew upset about the high tax Britain required them to pay on salt. The Indian Legislative Assembly demanded that Britain reduce this tax, but Britain refused. Mahatma Gandhi began organizing Indians to engage in non-violent resistance against British control of India, and one of his best-known efforts was his 1930s Salt Campaign. Gandhi's Salt Campaign kicked off the Indian independence movement. He and his followers walked nearly 250 miles along the Indian coastline, gathering sea salt, which was illegal under British law. Within a week, the Salt Campaign became a national movement of over 100,000 Indians. British police responded to Salt campaigners' civil disobedience with arrests and brutal violence. But the campaign worked. In the early 1930s, the British signed a pact promising to release political prisoners and permit Indians to collect sea salt. According to Kurlansky, this pact and Gandhi's campaign paved the way for Indians to secure their independence in 1947. Why salt played a pivotal role in the Indian independence movement. While Kurlansky emphasizes the important role salt played in the movement for Indian independence, he doesn't clarify why salt in particular played such a pivotal role. According to experts on social movements, Gandhi selected salt for his campaign for non-violent resistance for several reasons. Reason 1. The Salt Campaign increased the involvement of lower-class Indians. Britain's salt tax disproportionately affected lower-class Indians, who needed salt but couldn't afford the tax. The majority of India was poor or lower class. By appealing to them, Gandhi's movement gained a large following. Reason 2. Salt united Indians from different backgrounds. Gandhi's Salt Campaign enlisted the support of anyone who had access to seawater, and that group included Hindus and Muslims from various social castes. Choosing an issue, salt harvesting, that affected such a wide range of people ensured diverse groups would unite into a national movement. Reason 3. Salt made Indian independence tangible. The idea of independence was abstract, so Gandhi chose salt, something you can hold, as a symbol of Indian labor, self-sufficiency, and independence. Today, salt continues to be a symbol of India's hard work and self-sufficiency.